I had to switch to a new system, so if there's any problems with this video and the others after this, please let me know. So now in our word problem journey, we're looking at consecutive integers. The word consecutive means following one after the other in order without gaps. I like to cover this because this often confuses people. How do I write this, especially when you have to solve an equation to figure them out, because guess and check takes forever. So here's the idea. When I look at consecutive integers, one right after the other. So I look, -2 is a consecutive integer. Like it is an integer, -1 is an integer, and it would be the consecutive one from -2. So what we want to look at is, how do I go from one to the next when they're consecutive integers? Or more particularly, since I don't know the integers in the problems we solve, if I call this one x, what do I then have to call the next one? So for any one of these integers, when I move one to the right, how do I get there? I add 1. So I can call this, in the vague sense, x plus 1. And if we needed another, it's x plus 1, which is x plus 2. Now, most of the time, if Alex asks you to do one of these, it'll tell you use x for the smallest integer if they're going to ask you to type the equation in. Now, if they don't specify what x has to represent, then a lot of these problems are actually significantly easier if you put x in the middle. So the one before it would be -1, and the one above it would be +1. So if you had to add all those, you'd get 3x. So it can work out very nicely. Now, consecutive even, consecutive odd integers. These sometimes throw people for a loop. But let's take a look here. So if I start even integers, -2's even, 0's even, 2's even. So I want to look at, just like we did before, these jumps, because I'm thinking about what happens if I put x. Well, if this is an even integer, how do I get to the next even integer? Like from 0 to 2, we add 2. And then if I go the next, 2 and 2, this is x plus 4 now. And if I wanted the one before, it would be x minus 2. Now check this out with the odd integers. So we got -1, 1, and 3. What do I do to go from -1 to 1 or 1 to 3? The same thing I did for the evens. I add 2. So we would use the same thing. X plus 2, and x plus 4, or x minus 2x and x plus 2. All right, so now we have one that's going to give us some practice with translation a little and show us how to work one of these consecutive integer problems. So 5 times the sum of 3 consecutive integers is 1 less than 14 times the largest integer. Find the integers. Okay. So we have to find all 3 integers. These are consecutive, but not consecutive even or odd. So I like to have like a little key over here. So we could call the bigger one or the smaller one or the middle one. Since we are adding them, I'm going to go with the middle one, but it will work as long as these labels work correctly. It'll work either way. So x minus 1 is the smallest, x is the medium size, x plus 1 is the biggest size. So when it says the largest integer here, out of our 3, that is x plus 1. And then because that has more than one term, some addition or subtraction, when we're going to write the equation, we practice safe math, we put the parentheses. All right. Now let's backtrack up to this. How do we interpret this? 5 times the sum of 3 consecutive integers is, there's my verb at least, okay? 1 less than 14 times the largest. All right. So wherever that equal sign is, the stuff on one side stays on one side, the stuff on the other stays on the other. Don't move stuff around during the translation. Got plenty of time for that afterwards. All right, so we have 5 times the sum of 3 consecutive integers. So I figured out how I'm writing my 3 consecutive integers. Now we're going to backtrack. It says the sum. So I'm going to write those guys down and add them. Now just to be extra careful. I'm going to put parentheses around each of them. Now, some of you guys may be looking at that like, we don't need to do that. I know, but it doesn't hurt. And there's other problems where maybe you will. All right, so that was just the sum. We still haven't done the 5 times. Here's where translation can get a little tricky. If they just wanted 5 times one of them, then they would have said the sum of 5 times an integer and the next 2 consecutive integers. It gets kind of clunky, but if you're only going to apply the 5 times to one of them, the order gets rearranged. So when they say 5 times the sum, we're going to put a big set of parentheses and put a times 5 out there. Now we're just going to translate that other side. So we have 1 less than 14 times the largest integer. So just like we saw before, that less than construction is backwards. If I say 1 less than 10, common sense gut check tells us that's 9, but how would I write 10 and 1 so it would equal 9? I would write 10 minus 1. So we're going to do the 14 times the largest integer. Like I said before, safe math. And then 1 less than that is going to be minus 1. It's a whole lot of work to come up with that equation. Now, if you look, that equation has numbers and x's, not even any x squareds, just x's. So we can solve this. This is a linear equation in one variable. So, lots of ways to kind of go about it. First thing I always like to do, clean up the parentheses if I can, especially over here on the left in the orange. I picked the labels in this way because x plus x plus x is 3 x's, and then minus 1, no extra number, plus 1 is 0. So this whole thing is now just 3x. I still got the outer parentheses there in the 5. And then over here, the x plus 1, those are not like terms. One has a variable, the other doesn't. So we're just going to leave it. I like to do the same kind of thing in each step. So my first one was messing around inside parentheses. I didn't have to mess anything inside the parentheses on the right, so I leave it alone. Oh. All right. So just going to run through this. This is going to be 15x. We will distribute the 14, so that is 14x and plus 14. And then with the minus 1 still, aha, so we got some like terms there. And we also have x's on both sides. So I'm going to move the x's over here, and kind of rudely, I am also going to combine these guys at the same time. So 14 minus 1 is just going to leave 13 on this side. And then over here, we have x. So x is 13. But wait, Interpret your answer. What does that 13 even mean? If x is 13, if this is 13, and I called that the middle guy, then the consecutive integers would go one before and one after. So the integers are going to be 12, 13, and 14. So if I add these guys up, it's basically 13 times 3, 39. And then I multiply that by 5. And then over here, 14 is the x plus 1. So 14 times 14, 196 minus 1 is 195. And over here we had 5 times 39, 150, plus 45, 195. So it works. So we have found the answer. Now, I always like to go back to my original labeling setup, because sometimes you're going to have x be the first one, so you're going to find the next two integers after it. We even could have called the last one x, just because this label talks about the largest integer. It doesn't matter which way you do it, as long as you're consistent and you check your answer at the end so it fits the labeling you used. All right, so I'm going to stop this one.